Welcome everybody. Recently my mother passed away, and following my father, and I guess you're suddenly, and not suddenly, but you know, your attention's drawn to your family very intimately and memories of childhood, and there's an awful lot of stuff to go through as well. You know, all the belongings of the parents and so on and so forth. And one of the absolute treasures was my mother's, or is my mother's, photo album. As you can see, it has an Egyptian motif. That's because my father went to Cairo from what was Palestine at the time and bought this for her as a gift. And it's a sort of lasting memory of his time in Palestine. This is my father, mother and their small daughter when he first entered the army. And this is a photograph taken of him in Palestine, in the desert near Beersheba. And this is a photograph of him in his military position behind the machine gun. I asked him once, "Dad, why did you sign up to be a machine gunner?" And he said, "Well, when I signed up, they asked me what I wanted to do, and as a boy I'd been really interested in Vickers machine guns, which were invented during the First World War. And he thought that he'd be a machine gunner because of this fascination he had when he was a boy." This is a photograph that my mother sent him during his tour of duty. He went from Australia to Palestine, and then the Australian troops were brought back to Australia because of the Japanese threat, and he was then sent to New Guinea, and then to Borneo right at the end of the war, where he said they were mopping up because a lot of the Japanese soldiers wouldn't believe that Japan had surrendered and wouldn't let go of their positions. So my father's company were in there forcibly getting the Japanese soldiers to give up. And he tells a terrible story. One day my daughter was going to Borneo for a holiday with her father, and I said, "Dad, you were in Borneo, weren't you? What was it like?" And he said, and he started to tell us that during that time they had to fight from trench to trench to get the Japanese to surrender. And in some trenches they found human bones because the soldiers had resorted to cannibalism to keep alive because their supply lines were cut off. And he was bawling his eyes out at the kitchen table, saying, "The poor bastards." This was one of the extraordinary things about my father. He never had a prejudiced bone in his body. He always was able to have compassion, and I thought that was amazing that he would refer to the Japanese in that way, having been in conflict like that. So this is in Balikpapan in Borneo, and this was what the war was like there. So my poor dad suffered from what we would call now post-traumatic stress disorder. It was never diagnosed, but he displayed all of the symptoms, or symptoms of that condition. He used to sit with us, just staring off with this kind of stubborn jaw sticking out, not saying a word for hours on end when we had family get-togethers, as if he was repressing all of his emotions. He would wake from nightmares screaming out for his mother. He was an alcoholic. And most frighteningly, as it says here, the violence was triggered by all sorts of things. I remember him out in the paddock setting up the tractor with the plough, and he'd be screaming his head off, abusing, throwing things, just going completely berserk. And I'm sure that the manipulation of the machinery would trigger these traumatic outbursts. All of us were affected by this, but I think my brother's most of all, because he was determined to toughen them up. And in today's parlance, we would describe the way he treated his sons as child abuse. And my sister and I witnessed this and were not as traumatised, but certainly very badly affected by these incidents. So all of this came back to me when I was sitting with my mother towards the end of her life, and I said to her, "Mum, what did you do when Dad came back from the war so traumatised?" And she looked at me and she said, "Bonita, I didn't know what to do." And that's all she said. So my mother was incredibly resourceful. During the war, she set up a little business where she did sewing for people, and pretty much paid off the house while Dad was away in the war. And the sewing machine was a very central object in our household. She made all of our clothes. I distinctly remember the first time I got a dress bought from a shop, and that was when I was 9, and I was very happy about getting a dress from a shop. So for some reason, I was drawn to collapsing together the machine gun and the sewing machine. It's a very complex piece, I think. My first reading of it for myself was that I was kind of ameliorating the weapon of war by making it out of the female or the feminine machine, the Singer treadle sewing machine. But other people saw it and had different interpretations. Another interpretation is that perhaps the sound of the sewing machine would trigger traumatic episodes. Another interpretation has been that the sewing machine and as a machine gun kind of represents the tensions in the relationship between my mother and father, and so on and so on. It's made out of Mum's treadle sewing machine and bobby pins. I'll just show you some detail of how that came together. So I used all the bits and pieces, all the lovely little mechanisms from the sewing machine to represent the gun. And I guess one of the ironies is that the word singer appears on the treadle sewing machine. Yeah. So I decided that I should go to Egypt and Palestine, or Israel now, and retrace my father's tour of duty and just see what I would find there. So the first stop was Cairo, where Dad went on R&R, and of course my daughter came with me. We saw the pyramids, as he would have. I doubt that he would have seen this. And perhaps this is where he bought Mum's lovely leather photo album. There was lots of strife in Cairo at the time we were there, lots of graffiti everywhere about their struggles with the political system there. We first of all went to Suez, where my father disembarked. And everywhere we went, there were signs of past conflicts. This is Suez. This is also Suez. Unfortunately, the day we were there, it was very windy. There were no ships going through the canal. Then we headed for Taba, and passing through the desert, the Sinai Desert, at every step along the way, there were watchtowers, really ancient ones like this, and more current ones like this, with these massive walls that went for kilometre after kilometre after a kilometre, with the watchtowers periodically within sight of each other. Bam, bam, bam. And I started taking photographs of these watchtowers. And it wasn't unusual to the Sinai Desert. Everywhere we went throughout the entire journey, there were watchtowers everywhere. This is the border of Israel and Egypt. This is a military operation going on alongside the highway, like as if it was the Hume Highway, where young conscripts are being taught how to fire all of the military gear. This is a watchtower overlooking the Gaza Strip. You can see the Gaza wall in the background there. This is the West Bank. This is a wonderful image because it captures what we were doing, driving through the countryside with me manically taking photographs of every single watchtower that I saw along the way, and my daughter, my chauffeur, "Look, Mum, there's another one. Look, look, look." I ended up with about 300 photographs of watchtowers. This is in the Golden Heights. And this place is also in the Golden Heights. It's a huge complex looking out towards Lebanon and Syria, with underground tunnels going through the complex. So from this journey, you're actually very privileged to hear all this, because I usually don't talk about my artwork when it's in the making. When it's work in progress, I usually keep it all kind of with the lid on. But it's still very much work in progress. I've got some ideas for these watchtower photographs, but in the meantime, I made a watchtower out of a double bed from the period of my mother and father's early marriage. I'll just tell you a little bit about the aftermath of the war as far as the good things went. My father and mother were living in Mildura when the war broke out, and towards the end of the war, the government set up all kinds of agricultural projects including one in Robinvale, which was hardly a town at the time, and they signed up for a block to grow grapes and oranges.
What I'm going to do tonight is explore some works of art produced through the Memorials Official War Artist Scheme, which is a commissioning program where artists travel to conflict zones while attached to the Australian military. The artists I will review are Sean Gladwell, Lyndall Brown and Charles Green, who work together as one artist, and XD Medici. I will show how their work explores broad ideas related to the consequences of war. So how war affects the here and now, and of course these effects go on, they mutate, they reverberate for generations. In this quick talk, I'm interpreting the consequences of war to cover war's effects on bodies, psychologies, communities, and their sense of place. In focusing on the Official War Artist Scheme, I want to achieve two things. Firstly, I will provide other examples of how artists approach the consequences of war to broaden tonight's discussions, but I also want to show you the types of ideas that shape my approach to war as a curator at the Australian War Memorial. Before I discuss the Official War Artist Scheme, I want to quickly point very generally to some basic ideas about the consequences of war to contextualise the Official War Artist work. And I'll also apply very basic examples to these ideas as well. Since the Vietnam War, there has been strong investigation of the effects of war on bodies, individuals and communities, and this has been further intensified in the last decade, where whole schools of conflict studies have been developed at universities throughout the world. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have been crucial to the development of this academic niche industry. As in the past, state politics, security issues, as well as battlefield strategies still dominate the academic discussion surrounding war, but narratives related to the consequences of war have also matured. There is now a strong focus on the role of thinking, feeling bodies of men and women at the centre of conflict, including both soldiers and civilians caught up in war. Various studies explore the construction of the soldier's body as a site of training, discipline, as well as trauma. The way conflict shapes the bodies of civilians through anger, trauma, celebration, or the processes of remembering are also highly important. The effect of war on broader cultures and myth-making is also a major source of investigation and obviously highly significant. In Australia, we see this in the ANZAC legend, with its characteristics of mateship, endurance, larrikinism and ingenuity, which has had an incredible grip on Australia for almost a century, shaping a national viewpoint and much more. Our contemporary conflicts also shape the cultures in our contemporary culture in many ways. One of them, for example, is its influence on masculine identity. Think of the media and massive publishing industry related to soldiering, especially the SAS and recent VC recipients, which are consumed within our community by young and older men. Of course, the bodies, cultures and identities organised by war, which I have quickly alluded to, are not separate, but are very closely connected, and connected in very elaborate ways that go on for generations, as Bonita has showed us. And of course, Ben and Alex will also allude to that process. I think that's the value of the artworks, and certainly the three artists before us, is that they flesh out the way these things are interconnected and show them to us. But now I want to move on to the Official War Artist's work. And the first slide is by artist Sean Gladwell. And Joan is correct that there is an exhibition of Sean's work out at Casula Powerhouse. I was the curator of that exhibition. It's on until the 12th of May, and it's well worth going out even just to see Casula itself. It's an amazing space. Sean went to Afghanistan in 2009, and the work before you was actually produced in Australia. Sean wanted to make the work overseas in Afghanistan, but it just didn't quite come off. But he was very dedicated to this work. And what it is, you're seeing a still from a video work, a 2-channel video work. And it runs for approximately 8 minutes, and what happens is each of these soldiers come on, they strip down the weapon and build it back again and walk off. A field strip is a process where you pull the gun apart and put it back together to clean the gun so it can still can continue to work. And it's a practice which is quite central to soldiering. You have to learn this. It's crucial to your role. But it's also a ritual. People practice it. It becomes a skill that a lot of pride is attached to, of how fast you can do this process. So Sean Gladwell investigated this ritual, and I guess you could read it as a continuation to his videos that look at skateboarders and the way that skateboarding, the process of using a board relates to the subculture itself, and how the subculture builds meaning, and it relates to a physical culture. You can see on the right, the soldier is wearing the official dressing, and then on my left, he's wearing the desert cam, and it takes place in a training site as well. Sean is interested in the way that soldiers' bodies are developed, how they are constructed and developed as a soldier, how they become aware of space, how they exist in space. That was quite central to the work that he was making. Because he investigated the soldiers that he witnessed as he was in Afghanistan, the Australian Defence Force. He saw them as a type of subculture that brought to Afghanistan various rituals, various belief systems that were imposed upon the landscape and competed with other cultures that were there, other armed forces, as well as the traditional cultures that lived in Afghanistan. He's quite sensitive to the young soldiers, and he wanted to portray a sense of the soldiers themselves being somewhat, stranded to some degree, going overseas and trying to make sense of the world in which they are now involved in. And in these works, he quotes from Caspar David Friedrich's work, which often has a figure looking into a sublime landscape, and you see the figure from behind. So he adopts this colonial sense of the sublime, and he looks at it in a modern contemporary sense. The sublime is not only a vast landscape, but it's a complicated political space as well. And the Australian individual, the soldier, is in this sublime landscape. So he's investigating these types of ideas relating to soldiering. This work is also by Sean Gladwell, and it was completed in 2009 as well, and it was first shown at an exhibition in Casula as well, in an exhibition related to Vietnam, the Vietnam War. And they are pictures, scans of Sean's father, who was a Vietnam veteran. And the tattoos relate to his father's service. And Sean saw this work as focused on the tattoos, and saw the tattoos as kind of a memory, a trace of the conflict, the experiences of war and the experiences of being in the military, as still being present within the skin, being part of the body itself. So Sean brings this entire heritage to his work, and he's quite interested in the experience of being in the military and being in war. And for Sean, it's both obviously a positive and negative. He saw his father's experiences. He saw the trauma related to that, but he also saw the positives in the military life that aspects that his father enjoyed, which was the physical culture. That also Sean's father continued, it was a strong part of his life, and even Sean's as well. I'll move on now to Charles Green and Lyndall Brown's work, who I said worked together as one artist. Charles Green and Lyndall Brown travelled to Afghanistan and Iraq in 2007, And they were very fascinated with the way that, with the machines and the process of bringing in an entire military force into a landscape. And with Afghanistan, it's a landlocked country, you have to do this by air. So they focused on the technology, the helicopters or the aircraft that was able to fly thousands of kilometres and plonk this new militarised space onto the landscape. And they were fascinated by the landscapes, these alien, murky landscapes that evolved out of the military processes. They involve vast infrastructure, but they're not infrastructure airports that we have in Australia or shipping ports, which are meant to last for 50 or 100 years. They are vast infrastructure that allow this kind of developmental spaces and communication, but they dissolve and dissipate in years. These works actually incorporate the ziggurat of Ur within them. You can't make them out, but the ziggurat of Ur is a 3,000-year-old man-made building, and they're kind of showing the way that cultures are completely absorbed within these new militarised spaces. And as I said before, the culture and everyone within them become kind of alien and from these spaces as well. The individuals caught up in war, here you have a scene in Iraq of Iraqi soldiers in American uniforms. They're being trained by these Australians, and it was a very sad image for the artists, because it was individuals that were, through no choice of theirs, had been caught up in the processes of war. They're being trained to be soldiers, and it's highly likely that in the weeks after this photograph was taken, that this painting was based on, they would probably be dead or be fighting against the Australians as well. So the last artist I want to look at is Ex de Medici, who went to the Solomon Islands in 2009. And she looks at the experience of the Australian soldiers and the Australian Defence Force and their role in the Solomon Islands, and sees them as one of many forces, cultural forces that have washed up onto the island and have become part of the island. During the Second World War, the Japanese invaded the island, and then pretty much 6 months later the Americans took hold of the island as well. And at the end of the war, the Americans left all their equipment, all their aircraft, their ordnance. A lot of it, their ordnance wasn't exploded, they just left it as a big dump. But these again, she represents a similar sort of alien space, which is being taken over and it's, completely changed through the process of military forces coming to an island. This work here shows a Chinese and Japanese flag in the background of the palm oil plants, and she's trying to suggest again this contemporary realm of new forces, new international interests coming ashore and taking control of the island. And this was part of the political realm in which the Australians were involved in. But she certainly sees the Australians as part of this taking over, or part of the process of coming ashore as well. Throughout her career, for over the last 10 years, in fact, she's looked at weapons, machine guns, and she's linked them to various insects as well, and done this through an 18th century colonial kind of style. And what she's doing here is she's looking at the equating the guns to insects and viewing them as specimens made up out of particular cultural phenomena, and in fact specimens that can move around the world and do move around the world and have consequences in the way they kind of take over spaces. In this work, which was part of the commission, this is an Australian weapon, and I guess she's equating the peacekeeping forces, the Australian involvement in the peacekeeping forces, as part of this militarised realm which comes ashore and creates peace and then moves on to the next realm as well. So I'll just leave it there, Joanna, and just wanted to stress that these works are all about the consequences of war and the things that have effects through generations. Thanks, Joanna.
Hi everybody. Whoa. My images are in reverse, so I'm going to give my talk in forward, but the images are going to be in reverse, and at some point in the middle I'll cross over and it'll make perfect sense. And if it doesn't, well, maybe get the video and listen to it again later. I met Warwick, luckily, on the walk up here, and very arrogantly said, "I'm sure it's this way." And he said, no, it's this way. And I said, "No, it's definitely this way." And he said, "Ben, I'm a graduate." Inverted commas, shut up and follow me. And it reminded me of the night after my after Afghanistan exhibition, which opened down the road a few months ago. And after it, and I sort of felt that it could be, there could be tension, there was going to be alcohol, there was a lot of young men who'd just returned from Afghanistan who were full of angst. 4 out of the 11 that I worked with had been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder since I'd begun my project with the War Memorial. And at the very end of the night, having helped break up a fight between an SAS soldier and a 2 commando unit soldier, which I never thought I'd be able to say, never thought I really wanted to be able to say. Both of them ended up in tears, one of them in my arms and the other in another of my friends who also happens to be an artist around the corner of the pub, in his arms in tears. And a young 2 commando captain walked off into the night, and me and my wife Kylie were there and said, "Shane, where are you going?" And he said, "I'm going to King's Cross." We're on Darling Street, just down right at the top of the cross, but he was heading towards the airport. He had out his GPS and he's saying, no, Ben, exactly as I was doing to Warwick, "It's this way." I said, "Whatever you reckon, mate." So he watched this guy for 4 tours of Afghanistan, who's a JTAC in Afghanistan, so he's in control of air support as it comes in. Told me some of the most graphic stories of engagement that I'd ever imagined I'd hear, wandering off into the night in the wrong direction. We watched him, mind you, he'd had about 20 beers, look at his phone and then do that. And then walk straight back past the party of artists that I was with and head into the cross. We're all laughing. And it was sort of a profoundly moving moment of a young man, the metaphor of this young guy coming back from what is the most extraordinary place I've ever been in my life, back into a place like King's Cross, and the metaphor of him trying to fit in back into society. And it became very obvious to me when I was in Afghanistan that my show would all be made back in Australia, and then the War Memorial called it After Afghanistan. Obviously, and it's one thing, when I went to Afghanistan, I really did question what the war artist thing was meant to be. I'd been interested in Wendy Sharp's work years ago. I remember being intrigued by her as a person, having gone to this very violent part of the world and made works. And it was only once I got there that I realised that all artists' work is after the experience. I had a dinner with some well-known musicians before I went away, and one of the young women who's a well-known singer said to me, "I can't believe you're going to do this. I'm so anti-war, I would never do what you're doing." And I didn't have any comeback, I didn't know what to say, I just knew that I had to go there. And the difference between us as artists and the visual arts community and musicians, for example, is that we don't go there to entertain the troops. We go there completely empowered by the Australian War Memorial to tell whatever story we want. And really we're empowered to do that, to say exactly what we want to say. And in fact, right from the director of the War Memorial saying to me before I left, "We'll back you up, even if you tell a negative story, we're going to back you up." So that's the difference between a musician who goes there and can't really come back and mull over the ideas and make work for the next 12 months. So this is a work that I made in Afghanistan. This is actually JTAC, Captain Shane Mackay, who happens to be the brother-in-law of Nick Mitsevich, who's the director of the Art Gallery of South Australia. So one thing that really struck me about my experience of war was reading All Quiet on the Western Front. I was born the year after conscription finished in Vietnam. I was completely paranoid of being conscripted, and my mum always promised me that if I was conscripted, she'd hide me in a cave in the Blue Mountains. exactly that, and I was going to hold her to it. I didn't want to go to war. I'd read All Quiet on the Western Front when I was 13, and I think it's probably a bit young to read that book. But it left a very lasting impression on me of the horror of what the particularly young men have to go through in so-called service of their country. So this is Shane Mackay, who's also the guy who walked the wrong way towards King's Cross. And I followed his path as he left, as he came back, as he still works for the army. He told me a story of hiding. I actually painted him for the Archibald. Hopefully it's next. It's not, of course. All of them told me very graphic stories. And one of the things that I realised once I was there, I took over 1,000 photographs, which you'll see at the end of my talk, was that their experience is what I was interested in. I was interested in the human condition. I guess I'm always interested in the human condition. And most of my work is pretty autobiographical. So in a way, the paintings that I made are about my experience of Afghanistan through their often much more dramatic experience of being a soldier for 8 months in Afghanistan. This is the work in my studio shortly before it left for the exhibition. This is young Daniel Spain. So this work actually was made from a photograph. When I first got back, I'd taken a lot of photographs, as I said, over 1,000. A lot of them I got the guys to stare into the sun. I did similar thing to Deborah. I was looking for something. I was looking for some visual sign that would trigger later work, and possibly it was just an exhibition of photographs. But I found that getting these young guys to look directly into the sun was sort of, in a way, symbolic of the great force that they were facing, the great darkness, but an inversion of that it was so bright that it was dazzling to them. So really I'm just finding my way with this work, but I quickly realised that I needed those guys in front of me, and I needed them to bring that experience that I'd seen firsthand in Afghanistan. I needed them to bring it to me. And there's something about that age-old idea of portraiture, of having the person in front of you, and the portrait being a description of the time that you've spent with someone, a historical record, I guess, of the time that the artist spends with the subject. But this was then a much more powerful way to do that, by getting these guys into the studio, getting them naked, which is surprisingly easy. My wife always said, I was really worried as an artist you'd have all these naked women in your studio, and should I be more worried about all the naked men? But this is Troy Park, who was an ex-SAS soldier who was in Afghanistan, who was on his 8th deployment to Afghanistan, but the second 4 deployments was as a mercenary. So he was basically paid to be a private force inside Afghanistan. He really didn't like this painting, but a lot of them, and he said the same thing. He said, you've made me look the way I feel, and I think that's success from what I'm looking for. Obviously he's SAS, so I'm not meant to be showing his image, but no one can tell who it is anyway. And that's Captain S, that's Shane Mackay, the drawing that I showed you earlier, the guy that got lost in King's Cross. This is the first live sitting that I made. I got him in, I told him the idea. I said, Shane, there's only one catch, I need you to get all your gear off. And before I finished the sentence, he was unbuttoning his shirt. He just returned from Afghanistan. He'd been back 3.5 weeks when I got him to my studio. And I've since read a lot about the euphoria that young men have when they first return. Unlike Deborah's dad, who would have taken 2 to 3 months to return, I was on a plane out of Al Minhad Air Base and back in Sydney in under 24 hours. And these guys I was with, 300 of them on a huge big white plane, had exactly the same experience. So the euphoria and resettling in a way that happened on the ships coming back now happens back in the community, and I think it's a real problem and something the ADF needs to be very aware of. But Shane was absolutely euphoric. He was massive, hugely fit, physically unbreakable, but emotionally pretty frail. Well, later became more and more emotionally frail, as they all do. After about 3 months they start having issues, and by 6 months they either present with post-traumatic stress disorder or they don't, and they then sail on through their lives. It's funny becoming friends with these guys, because you suddenly I realised with Shane, I haven't asked you the most fundamental question to my friendship with you. Are you going back to Afghanistan? And it's a hard question for them to answer, and a very hard question for me to consider, having built a friendship with this person, that they're going to go back and do another 8 months in this 2-commando unit inside Afghanistan. So this is getting towards the end of the presentation, which should be the beginning of my words, but this is an image that I made inside Afghanistan using Photoshop. If you look up close, it's pretty rough. It's literally a collage playing with the idea of my Rorschach thing that I've been doing. But this is all taken off 2 Taliban guys who were caught. We don't really understand the complexities until you get there. The Taliban are allowed to carry up to 500 grams of opium on them. They're allowed to have it. The Taliban aren't, but any Afghan men are allowed to carry an AK-47. They're allowed to have one what do you call it? What's the case? 30 bullets for an AK-47, up to 500 grams of opium. But if they're caught with a mobile phone battery, they're arrested instantly, because there's no mobile reception in the Uruzgan Valley. The only reason anyone has mobile phones is to detonate IEDs. So this basically was the stuff that the Australian military had taken off these men. This is one of the photos that I took. Sean Gladwell and I went to uni together and are still very close friends. We actually wagged a whole year of professional practice and still passed. In hindsight, professional practice is the one thing I should have paid attention to. And it's funny, Sean's work wasn't publicly shown while I was in Afghanistan, but I came home with all the fronts of these guys' faces looking up at the sun, he'd just gone through that process of arming and disarming his rifle. It was about 42 degrees, which Sean then made a video of the guys arming and disarming. It's a profound thing to watch these guys doing, because they're just doing it to the clock, but there's a real sense of pressure on them, because if they have to do that out under fire, it's the difference between life and death, and every second counts. So that work that Sean made is extremely profoundly moving for me to see. This guy had just completed that. It's extremely hot, a lot of pressure on him to pass. He has to do it under a certain time to be allowed to go out into the theatre of war. I would have been failing it, just so that I didn't have to go out. And at the same time, Sean was about to release all these works at the back of guys' heads, which got around the whole thing of not being allowed to, not being able to show people's identity. Obviously, I took photos of everything. This is 2 journalists about to be embedded with this young group of guys. If you look at them, they're seriously young guys driving out in a Bushmaster. This is the Australian vehicle that is quite famous in this war, because it saved so many people's lives. More images of me shooting to try and get something. This is the ANA on the range in Tarancot, firing 50 calibre machine guns. That's exactly what your dad was shooting, a 50 calibre machine gun, but very different now, much more powerful. And this is Shane in Afghanistan, and the only photo that I took of Shane, and I didn't know why. He asked to take me up on the range, which this is the range, and you're well within the firing distance of Russian rifles in this spot, so they don't spend a lot of time sitting around there, except when they're firing out, because no one's going to fire back when there's massive weaponry coming out at them into the desert. And I didn't really understand why Shane got fully kitted up. We're inside the base. He wanted me to take this photo of him, and then as I got through my deployment, I realised that all of the guys like to have a current photo taken of them in case they're killed, so that their family has the most up-to-date version of what they looked like before they were killed. And I ended up taking about 30 of these photographs of different guys. Would you mind tomorrow, can you just meet me and get a photo? We never talked about why. I knew why, I worked it out, but it's an incredibly sad and confronting thing to be a part of. This is another young Special Forces guy. And that's about 15 minutes, I think. Thank you all for coming tonight.
First of all, thank you for having me here. Sorry to cut into your time, guys. It was just that I've been asked by one of the fathers of one of the casualties recently in Afghanistan to tell his story of his son, and also the consequences in the aftermath of his son's death. But I've been interested in making work that's about the aftermath and consequences of war. And as a marble sculptor, of course, I've been approached many times to make memorials, and the idea of memorial is imbued into the material. Stone and granite monoliths that pepper social spaces across the world, all very similar in format. And I'd made this work called As of Today, which was originally inspired by the fact that I, like most of you here, and like a few down the front, only have an experience of war through the news media, to see it as another statistic. And I thought I'd make a memorial that was actually an ongoing memorial to an ongoing tragedy. And the fact that every day we would see in the newspaper in the last couple of years, 5 more guys hit by a rocket, or an IED had taken out 1 more soldier. And it seems so distant removed from our daily lives. I thought I'd just make a very simple marble work and make it as a dedicated act. The idea that I would make one every time I saw that there was another casualty in Afghanistan. And the fact that this war is ongoing would have this cumulative effect. Now, at first, of course, I didn't really think about that very much. As in, I didn't think of the direct consequence of each one is a name, each one is a body, and each one has a family, has friends, has kin. And this is actually the ceremonial fashion in which Australia uses to fold the flag. Everyone knows the American triangle that you fold, and you see it in films and such. The Australian official version of folding the flag is in fact this concertinaed square effect. Using pink, fleshy pink Australian marble, I set about making one for each time there was a casualty in Afghanistan. Now, because of that, in fact, Warwick and at the Australian War Memorial, they were to acquire a few of these works. The family of Matthew Lambert was to see the work, and I was contacted by them earlier this year by Christopher Lambert, and he was interested in having me come and see his memorial. He had this idea for a little space, and he really quite liked the work that he saw at the War Memorial, and was so kind and generous in opening his doors and to me to tell his story. I should give you a little bit of background to Matthew Lambert. Matthew Lambert was 26. He died on the 22nd of August in 2011 by an IED. He took 24 hours to die of his wounds. It was a rather gruesome death, I'm told. Christopher Lambert was lying in a hospital bed in Queensland. This is his father. When he heard the news, Christopher Lambert had had severe cancer and had had an operation when he found out that his only son had died in his first tour of Afghanistan. Now, of course, that's a great impact and shock to a family. They speak of Matthew Lambert like they speak of every talented, bright, inspirational kid. 26 years old, and he'd kept the family had some strife earlier on. The parents were separated. He kept them together. He was known as very bright in all of his studies and inspiration to his friends. And he had accumulated a large group of admirers and had a young, bright wife. I'm sure this is a tale that's familiar and can be told of many of the casualties. The thing about Matthew Lambert is that he'd inspired so many people around him that when, of course, the death came about, everyone was in massive shockwaves. His mates weren't able to talk about it, but let alone the good mates he'd served with. And the mates he'd served with, there was massive consequence. The mates he'd served with, amongst the mates he'd served with, 2 of them took to just going around Australia as transients, and they still do. And apparently this is quite a common story. And another one was to kill himself 1 year later. Now, Christopher Lambert having recovered from his cancer and dealing with the loss of his son's death, was to look to see all these mates that Matthew used to keep together and could see this devastating consequence, though not just with those who'd served with, but with those who had been just very close with Matt. And he decided that, you know, he could deal with his son's loss, but he couldn't deal with the fact that nobody was talking about the suicides 12 months later, the ripple effects. So he decided that he'd at least try and talk to his local RSL chapter. Now, when he initially approached them, then the RSL chapter said, "It's an ongoing conflict, mate. We don't want to have anything to do with that. You know, when you have a full list of our, you know, those locals who served, we'll put up a plaque." And of course, that intensely frustrated Christopher Lambert, and he wanted to do something that would bring the friends together. And so he decided to build, and this is the heart of the story, he decided to build a shed. And he's continuing the shed to this day. It's only started a year ago, where what he decided to do is build basically it is nothing more than a shed, but it's a communal space. This idea, he sent me these images last week because he so badly wanted it to be seen. And he's obviously intensely proud of it as well. Because the idea was to wrangle all the mates, all those he'd served with who were nowhere. They in and out, driving around Australia, not really settled down. This was an idea that he could contact them all and they'd take him seriously, because somehow authority and organisations don't really pull them together the way a father of a mate you dearly love does. And he said, "Come and build this. Come and build this with us. Come and let's make a space to Matt." So they built it so that it can, some of the families of these guys can all get together some days of the year, nominate it, or even just drop by, and they'll always have a place to not only remember Matthew, but to just have it as a safe space all of their own. They're encouraged, of course, to bring in tributes and memorabilia to Matt. Matt, you know, obviously was quite an inspirational guy. By the way, his father talked to him. He was someone that managed to dig almost everyone else out of trouble. And this is the space as it's almost close to looking like when I saw it earlier this year. And it will be a communal space that has a gym. These guys like pride themselves on personal fitness. They camaraderie. There's a bed with a loft with enough rooms for at least half a dozen beds or so. And obviously this is very different to your traditional memorial, and this is why I thought I'd at least bring this up. And this is entirely the appropriate forum to tell a story such as this, where these guys are looking for a way of remembering those that lost and to commemorate the act. Commemorate those that had fallen, but also to find a space where they could talk to each other. Christopher Lambert, I'm happy to say, has had some movement with the RSL chapter after a good year of fighting them, when even just getting them to acknowledge that the Afghanistan conflict exists and that the role of an RSL, let alone memorials, needs to change in a way that deals with the aftermath, the living aftermath of war. And that's where I'll leave it.